Sorry, there was a little hiccup. My iPad decided to start being weird. Okay, but so back to it. So we're looking at the Kinsey Scale. And, oh yeah, so like I said, most people aren't going to fall in strictly, 0 to 6. If you're using this scale, they're going to fall somewhere in between. And I mean, that's the whole point of this research, is looking at the complexity of human sexuality, and understanding that and appreciating that, Okay, so moving on to slide 38. So this is just informing you what we're going to be talking about. So I think most of us are probably familiar with this, or have thought about this and or have experienced this in our lives to some degree, that there are negative and positive and a lot of in between in terms of like cultural or social views on sexuality. So let's talk a little bit about this. So slide 39, birth control. So usually in class, I ask this question whenever for the males and the females, and not always, but I typically get a different response from both, but I'll ask this question. Have you ever felt uncomfortable or judged when purchasing contraceptives like condoms at the store? And typically, not always, but typically I get the response from males that they don't feel uncomfortable at all. In fact, they might even feel, it's not even like a neutral thing, they might even feel like they get a positive response from it. But for the females, now not always, but I would say more than not, this response from the female students is that they tend to feel a little more uncomfortable, or they feel at a minimum, they feel like someone is judging them, like the person, like the clerk at the store or something. So not always, but that tends to be the norm. And so, that's something to kind of think about, like in terms of sexuality, that like why. And like I said, if you're taking the cultural class with me, we spend a lot more time on this, but just for this class, think about that in terms of sexuality, that as humans we are a sexually reproducing species. Obviously males and females are both involved in that process, but culturally there's so much more going on that's built on top of that, some good, some bad, some neutral, in terms of that experience. And so it's interesting to kind of pick that apart, especially like from an evolutionary perspective. So that's the point of this class, is looking at it, I guess the cultural and social, how that can inform on it, but also looking at this in terms of the evolutionary experience, or the evolutionary process, I should say, and how that informs on this as well. So I would ask you, how do these like social or cultural like taboos or experiences of males and females and how they differ, how is that impacted by the evolutionary process? Like, you might think, well, how can it be, or I'm not sure. It seems as if it's only like social or cultural. But when you think about this in terms of some of the stuff we'd already kind of talked about, I think in part 1, about males and females and their roles in sexual reproduction, and the different strategies that evolutionarily, the reproductive strategies that males and females will often have, not even just including humans, but like primates or mammals, like what is, not always, but what is often the strategy in these terms of like when you have a sexually reproducing species. So for primates, what we tend to see, not 100%, because like I said before, I've said multiple times, nothing in nature is 100%, but what we often tend to see is that the females are the ones who tend to do the majority of the caretaking for the offspring, like after, once they're born, and the males do not. Now, of course, like I said, there will be exceptions to that rule, but this is generally true. And so humans as primates, as mammals, like we're going to fit into that category. So even if we're talking about just human sexuality, this is true. Now you might say, wait a second, that might be true in in nature or like instinctually maybe, but we are, as humans, we might be kind of above that. We understand that there is responsibility on both parts. And you might even be thinking, I know plenty of women who are not responsible, who aren't the caretakers, and many men who are, and that is absolutely true. I'm not saying that that's not true. But the point of this is that that's, as a general rule, what I'm saying is also accurate, that what we tend to see is that females tend to do the majority of the caretaking after. Now, before, there's really no debate on it, that biologically there's a process for females in terms of like gestating for 9 months, multiple months, a very lengthy period of time, the energy and resources that from her body that is being used in that process, the breastfeeding, that biological process of breastfeeding that only females can do afterward for that infant. Like there's a larger toll on the female's body reproductively just in that initial stage that males don't have. They're not contributing anything to that. Now you might, like I said before, you might say, well, okay, that might be true, but still socially and culturally after that point, there's like a shared, division of labor in terms of caretaking. But I would say like a lot of the research is showing that's not quite accurate. While individually you might say, well, I know someone who, that's probably true, because clearly we, like as adults in the world, we know that's accurate, that there are probably instances where women are not taking on any caretaker role and the fathers are, like, absolutely. But in terms of like the overall population, it is still the other way around. And this informs on a lot of interesting information about like human sexuality and evolution. And this is the point of this, is that, hold on, my computer's being weird. Go away. Okay. Is that the strategies are going to be a bit different for males and females. Like I said, whether we're talking about humans or other primates or mammals, but humans included in that. In that, because the initial strategy of reproduction is different, what follows will also be different. So males, I'll start with females. So because females are investing, they already know, like, their investment, even just the initial investment, the biological investment in her body and the energy, the resources is so much more than any initial investment from a male. There's going to be a little bit more impact on her in terms of like, and this is what we were talking about before with sexual selection, that the potential mate or the mate that she does end up picking, she has to be a little more cautious with that choice, because the outcome for her in terms of reproduction is there's going to be a lot more on her, at least initially, and at least like reproductively, like biologically, in that, like in her body, the consequences of that are going to be a lot more more of a toll on her, versus the male, they're not going to be. So this makes sense then that females are going to be a little more choosy. They're going to have, their standards will be a little higher, because the investment's going to be so much more in that initial like biological process. For the males, it's not. So what we see is kind of ends up translating a little bit to how we feel socially and culturally about human sexuality. Because you might be saying, yes, I get why, like, that's accurate, and females are obviously like gestating a fetus. The whole process takes many, many months. There's a lot going in. The whole like anatomical, physiological process is very complex, and she's investing a lot of her time and emotions and energy and resources, like literally, and the male is not doing it. That process is not the same for him. And you might be thinking, well, how does that translate then to like human sexuality? And I'll tell you, like, what we end up seeing is that this clear link between that and these rules, I think, that are placed on us as males and females in our society, that female sexuality is often more policed in some way than male sexuality because of this. Because while I don't think we pick it apart this much, like when we think about it, but it's true that females, it's kind of an unwritten rule that I think I want to say like cultural rule, but kind of based on something innate that we feel in some way in terms of like this evolutionary process, although I don't think people would really pull in that deep from their minds to phrase it in this way. But this is definitely what's occurring, is that because of this strategy of being more cautious and careful, and probably being a little more, what's the phrase? Choosing quality over quantity, that translates to how we feel about female sexuality in general. And so, like I said, you might be thinking, okay, I get that, but it shouldn't matter whether you're male or female. It shouldn't matter like how many people I've slept with. It shouldn't matter whether I sleep with anybody or not. It's no one else's business, as long as there are obviously consenting adults. That's absolutely true. So this is what we talked about before with the first one, sexual selection, that we can say we understand why this process is happening, this biological process, or even how it translates into a cultural, attitude. We can understand that. It clearly makes sense. Doesn't necessarily mean we have to accept it as not being problematic in some way. And so this is the point I'm making, that we understand, okay, because of these strategies, that males tend to have a strategy of quantity over quality in terms of like, primates and mammals, and females of the species tend to have more of a strategy of quality over quantity, that ends up translating to how we kind of view this in terms of like the cultural expectations of males and females in terms of sexuality. I hope that makes sense. Like I said before, I'm not excusing the obvious, problems with that in terms of like how we view males and females, males and females in terms of sexuality in our culture and other cultures. Like they're connected, but also kind of two separate issues. Okay, so this is what I kind of want to touch on this, just to get you thinking a little bit about how those biological and cultural things can often, go together. So back to this original thing on slide 39. So like I said before, most of my female students would say that they definitely feel a little more judged because of this. But it's interesting when you really think about it, because it's like if you are an adult making a responsible decision to purchase contraceptive for your own health, for your own well-being, for the well-being and health of your partner, whether it's someone you're seeing casually or someone who you're seeing long-term, we still view that as a negative, even though you are doing the responsible and right thing, that we still view it as a negative if you're a female versus if you're a male. Now, clearly, like with a lot of these social and cultural things, we're starting to see a big shift, like 10 years ago to now, and I'm sure in 10 years it'll be different, but we're still kind of in the midst of that. Like, it's still accurate, And then just another thing to kind of think about in terms of like, because of the biological process of reproduction for males and females, the types of contraception is often going to be a lot more complex, time-consuming, painful for a female than it is for a male. So I have a list here of a few things. Like if we're talking about birth control, we could talk about like condoms, obviously, and the cost involved, like of males or female purchasing it, a few dollars. But other things, like if we talked about taking the birth control pill, that's something that females do. Now, you might be aware that they were trying to get like a male birth control pill formulated, but I guess trial runs weren't positive. We'll see how that goes. But also things like IUDs for females, or getting like their tubes tied, or other forms of permanent sterilization. We see that in the females. Now, you could counter that and say, yes, but males can get a vasectomy. That's absolutely true. But then if we were making a list, the number of options that are available, it's skewed more towards options for females, which you might be thinking, wasn't that a positive? But when the responsibility is solely on her because of her biology, and it makes sense, like because of her biology, it's still another, like, it adds on to the load in terms of like sexuality for females, that it adds on to that. So I just had a point here that I wanted to make for you about permanent sterilization, that I have a picture here of, because I think I mentioned this to you guys before, that I'd had a procedure done. So I had something done called Esure, and it's this picture here like in the middle. So I had I was awake for this process. It's like outpatient. They had me like sedated and numbed, but there's no incision. They go in vaginally, and I had nickel coils put in my fallopian tubes, and what happens is over the course of like 4 months, scar tissue forms around the coils, and then when I ovulate, like the egg kind of just gets absorbed back into my body. It doesn't go, there's like a barrier between so there's no like fertilization. So that's what I had done. It's non-reversible. Versus with vasectomies, they are reversible. But there are, like I said, plenty of options for females. And for any of the females who had experience with IUDs, I have not, but one of my very close friends has, and I have 2 close friends who were telling me about it. Just the pain involved, the time involved, and mostly the pain, the discomfort with the initial like insertion process, and some of the complications that can arise from that. So something to think about. And then the other question, kind of to follow this up, is I would ask, if we were in class, for any of the females, do you feel that there is that you are judged in some way for getting access to things like birth control, or any kind of maybe other form of more like long-term, like an IUD, or like a permanent type of sterilization like Esure, or getting your tubes tied or something? That do you feel like there's any kind of judgment put on that? And I'll tell you, so in terms of like gendered expectations, that I had this done in my early 30s, and because I'd known since I was young I didn't want kids, and I thought maybe I would change my mind when I got older, and I just never did, and I just became more and more sure of that as I got older. And then into my 30s, I was like, why do I have to keep taking a pill every month or every week? Oh my God, every day, Jesus Christ. And so I talked to my my gynecologist, and she was like, actually, because I was thinking I'd have to have some surgical procedure, which I didn't know if I was ready for, so I just talked to her about it. And she's like, actually, there's a procedure we do now called Esher. She's like, I've been doing it for like 10 years now. Totally fine. We can set this up for you. She's like, we have a waiting period of 30 days. Once you sign the paperwork that you want to do it, we have a 30-day waiting period until the actual procedure, just to give you time to think, look over the literature, because it is a permanent decision. And I was like, that's fine. And so then I went in and had it done. But I've heard so many stories from other women who have had such difficulty trying to get some kind of procedure like this done if they have not had children. And this is what I was making the point about gendered roles. There's often this gendered expectation that as women, we're supposed to want to be mothers, that it's ingrained in, I mean, look, go to the toy aisle and you're going to see like little baby dolls, and you wonder, like, you got 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds playing with baby dolls, and you wonder why they, you know, at 16, 17 want to get pregnant. Like, these things are clearly connected. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but when you see that on the flip side of this, you don't see, you know, baby dolls in the boys' toys, then you start to pick it apart, like, well, we're teaching little girls to be mothers, we're not teaching little boys to be fathers. That's interesting. That's a point of discussion for sure. And so we grow up with this expectation that we're supposed to want to be mothers in some way, or we're supposed to be nurturing. I've had so many times where people have asked me, like, oh, do you want to hold my baby? I'm like, not really. Like, I don't hate kids. Like, I have 2 nieces who I'm very close with, and I love them, and I absolutely love being an aunt, but like, it just, you know, motherhood's not for me, and it's not for some people, male and female, like, you know. But if we were able to have this discussion in class, you know, I would ask this question, and I'd probably, because I've asked this question to my students before, that for males who say that they don't want children, people might be like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess it makes sense, sure. But for females, like, you know, 80% of the time, 90% of the time, it's usually there's some negative, like, oh, you'll change your mind. You don't really mean that. You know, you just have to meet the right man. You know, you must be just a cold person. Like, none of those things are accurate, you know. Those aren't related things. So I feel like I went on a huge tangent about this. But anyway, so just thinking in terms of, like I said, kind of bringing this all together. These gendered expectations, the evolutionary process, human sexuality, and how these things all kind of, you know, go together. Okay, so just to kind of continue with that discussion. Slide 40. So this is just a series of kind of questions to think about. I'm not going to go through each of these. But just like how we view extramarital or premarital sexuality for males and females in our society. So like I said, this is more of a question for the cultural class, but I put it in here just so you guys can kind of start thinking about those things. But let's go to slide 41. So double standards. So typically in class, this is when I would ask you, what are some names or labels that you might hear for men and or women based on sexuality, like positive and negative? And typically what we, as a class, what ends up happening is, you know, I make a list on the board, and it's usually mostly negative terms. Sometimes there's positive terms, so it's mostly negative terms. And most of those negative terms are often associated with females. So it brings up so many questions, like sex, like I'll say, sex is something that you should enjoy, whether you're a male or a female. It's something that's pleasurable. It's something you should enjoy doing. It's a positive experience, or at least it should be. Hopefully you find a partner who at least, you know, respects your boundaries, who enjoys being with you, who wants to make you happy. Maybe you're in love, maybe you're not, like, that's up to you, you know. But it's an overall positive experience, as it should be. However, when you think of it that way, but then you think, why do we have such a negative view of it if it's something we all do as adults for the most part, and it's something people enjoy doing? Why is there such a negative connotation to it? Like, it's so interesting. We can pick it apart right now, you know, and it's not like I'm the first person to have that thought. Like, you guys are, as adults in the world, you have probably, male and female, have probably thought of it in those ways. So here's just some more questions to that. This idea of, like, are there double standards? Probably yes. some negative and some positive, you know. So here we have some questions. What are some of the negative words associated with male or female? So what I've heard before in class, I've heard, you know, obviously things like slut or whore. Someone said, I was like, are there any negatives for a guy? Someone told me last semester, fuckboy. I was like, okay, yeah, that's, I would say that's probably true. But then there's a lot of positives. What about the positives? I hear things like player. Typically we associate that with a male, right? Not the female. So while we can say there's probably negative and positive terms on both sides, positives tend to be more skewed towards the male and negatives tend to be more skewed towards the female. So it's just interesting. And then obviously per this, what are some of the positive words? What are some incorrect assumptions that we have about male and female sexuality? Think about any incorrect assumptions you might have. So that movie I told you guys before, the movie Kinsey talks about this, like towards I think it's towards the beginning of the movie, they talk about this couple comes in for counseling, and I forget the exact scene because it's been years since I've seen it, but it's something like the husband never gives his wife oral sex because they both think that if he does that, she somehow won't be able to get pregnant later. And like there's a few other things in the movie they talk about, these misconceptions that people have. Or like I don't know if I told you this class that I had a friend who I think it was this class that I had a friend who thought that you couldn't get pregnant the first time you had sex. So a lot of people have these misconceptions. And sometimes they are very skewed towards like female sexuality or male sexuality. So, you know, think about that. Think about if there's any that you have heard or experienced in some way, or maybe you thought were, then you learned that those, you had a misconception that it was later shown to be incorrect. And then, like I already pointed out, why do we view sexuality in such a negative way? In general, but also like if you're looking at male or female, you know, why do we view it negatively when it should be a positive thing? And then, this is a good question. How do we view virginity in society? So I would say typically we view it in terms of like something you lose or you give to someone, and like that has so many like, you know, social and cultural and psychological layers to it as well, especially if you're male or female. Like, is it a positive thing for a male or a female? Is it a negative thing? I'm sure like you have your own opinion on that, and we could probably agree in general that it tends to be more of a negative for females and more of a positive for males. Probably exceptions to that, but that's probably generally true. And so like none of this is probably a surprise to you that we have these social and cultural views on sexuality that tends to be skewed in a negative way for females. It's just unfortunate. Okay. So slide 42. How do we perceive and categorize sexual experiences? So if I asked you, what is sex? And not like male, female, like the binary. Like, what is, like, sex? Think about that. If I asked you what is sex, you probably have an image in your mind of what it is. And I would ask you, are you thinking of heterosexual sex? Is that the first thing that came to mind was heterosexual sex? And it might not have been, probably for the majority of you it was, just given like statistics, but not everyone, the majority of you that would have been what you thought of. And you probably would have thought of what we call PIV sex, penis and vagina sex, like penetrative sex. As most of you are probably aware as adults in the world, PIV sex is one of, 1,000 things you can do with your lover, whether you're two males, two females, a male and a female. There are so many other things you can do, right? And probably many things that you do. But we still have this kind of the standard of like, that's sex, like that thing, like that particular act, that one act, even though there are many, that one act is sex. That's the standard, that's like the main event, that's whatever. Every person should want to do that. But we know that's like just not accurate. Some people just don't prefer that. Well, one, if you're not heterosexual, that you're not thinking of it in terms of that. If there's no penis or there's no vagina. So you're not even thinking in terms of penetrative sex in those terms. But also you might enjoy penetrative sex in another way, or you might not at all. So we know as adults in the world that it's while we might say, okay, socially, culturally, like we understand that there's some like standard that we all kind of know is there, even though realistically in the world we're all doing a bunch of different things and everyone enjoys different things, and some people don't enjoy this and other people do, and like the list goes on, right? But we still, I think, have this standard in our mind. Just like before, I think I mentioned this to you guys, that if I asked you, like, what's the beauty standard for the United States for women, you might say, well, I don't agree, but the standard is like, tall, skinny, and, blonde or something. We could all agree, like, maybe there is a standard, a beauty standard in our culture, even though in reality, a lot of people don't really adhere to that. Like, they don't fit that standard. They don't like that standard. Like, there's variety in all those things. So it's kind of similar in that. So going down the list, do you think there are different levels to sex? So I've heard this, oral sex is, kind of down here, and then, penetrative sex is up here. Like, do you feel that's accurate? Do you feel like they're all kind of equal? Do you feel like there are levels, like somehow there's a hierarchy to them in terms of like what you should be wanting or what is better? Like, think about that. Because if someone is like, I do not enjoy penis and vagina sex, even if you're heterosexual, like maybe I just don't enjoy that. What does that do to that person when they are being told by maybe their lover or society, like, this is what you're supposed to want, this is what you're supposed to want? How do you think that's going to affect them as a male or a female, they don't fit that standard? What type of sex are socially acceptable? So this is what I was saying before about, with the previous slide, with like premarital or extramarital sex, or even just like certain acts, like certain sexual acts might be even like illegal in certain states, or it's not even that long ago that this was true, and it's probably still true for some areas. And then this last bullet point, how does the standard of PIV, now that you guys know what that is already, how does the standard of PIV influence how we view other types of sex or sexual pleasure and or performance? So very specifically, homosexual sex and female sexuality. So one, if you are not a heterosexual, PIV sex is like, that's not what you're doing. Whether you are male or female, that's not what you're doing. So like that standard is not your standard. Now you might be doing something kind of analogous to that depending on your personal preference, that's true, but you're still not doing that thing. And the other thing is the female sexuality. So if I asked you, what is the male sex organ? So answer that question, like right now, out loud or in your head, I don't care. Okay, so probably everyone said penis, right? Okay, so now, on the other end of that, what is the female sex organ? I probably got a lot of different responses. And in class, this is true. Usually I have a bunch of people yell at the wrong thing, and then someone whispers, clitoris. That's usually what happens. Like, yes, you don't need to whisper it. Someone yelled penis a second ago. It's the clitoris. It's not the vagina. But think about what that means in terms of like everything we've kind of been talking about in this section, and especially like with the stuff on this slide. That what we consider like the standard or the normal or the expected, especially if you're heterosexual, the expected type of sex is PIV, penis and vagina. Even in the wording and the act itself doesn't even address the female sex organ. But that's the standard. That's considered like normal standard sex. What does that mean for females, for female sexuality, that the standard sex doesn't involve her sex organ? Like, what do you think that means in terms of like her sexual experience? But what does that also mean in terms like psychologically, socially, culturally, like all these other ways we can talk about that? And what does that mean for men as well? So I'll give you guys a story. So I had a friend who, there are so many stories like this. I'm sure every one of you watching, whether you are a male or a female, have a similar story of a friend or you or someone else you know. Like, but I had a friend, this was like years ago, she was dating this guy, and they only dated for a few months, but she said the first few times they had sex, it was really great. And they had PIV sex. And some foreplay and some other things. But she said it was great, but then like those first one or two times was great, but then after that, like for like a month or two, it just wasn't. But she was faking it. She was faking having an orgasm with him. And I said, why did you do that? I said, that's not fair to you. That's not fair to him, She was like, yeah, but I felt bad. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to hurt his feelings. And I said, yeah, but now you've spent 2 months, well, one, like, being untrue to your, like, lying to yourself and lying to him in a sense. And also you've spent the last 2 months, like, not enjoying something you should be enjoying. You've made that sacrifice, and, like, for what? And so we had this whole conversation about it. And I was like, I think if you want to continue dating him, you need to say something. Like, for both of your sakes. Like, you want to be able to enjoy your intimate time with him. And you're not going to if you keep lying. And his feelings might be hurt for a minute. But I think and I told her this, I'm like, any mature man understands that every woman likes something different. Maybe you can even say, I like that thing that we did initially, but then I kind of didn't like it after that. I kind of want to change it up. Like, you can always frame it in a positive way. Let's try something new. And she was like, okay. But then I started thinking about this, and so many women, there have been scientific studies on this about, like, self-report studies of women, like, it's something like, I don't know, like, I'd have to look at it again, but, like, it's high amount of women, like 80 or something percent will have faked or will fake, or, oh my God, have faked either at least once or multiple times in their life, having an orgasm when they're with a man. And usually the reasons are very similar to what my friend had said. Like, I didn't know how to say what I wanted. I was embarrassed. I didn't know how to say I didn't like what they were doing. I didn't want to hurt their feelings. Like, and the list goes on, right? But like I said, how does, take what we were talking about in this PowerPoint, how does this inform on that it's often because we have this standardized view of what sex is supposed to be, what we're supposed to enjoy, and especially as women, it's the standardized sex isn't even addressing your sex organ. And it's only gonna, if you're not being able to, if you cannot communicate in a relationship with someone, whether it's a casual or a long-term relationship, that what you want and what you enjoy, because everyone, there's variety in everything, and so everyone's gonna want something different, and so you should be able to, communicate with your partner, even on, like, if it's just like a one-time thing. You should still be able to communicate with that person. Hey, I'm about to get naked with you, or partially naked with you. This is what I like. This is what I don't like. And is that going to work for you? But I hear over and over again so many times, and the scientific studies back this up, that people, mostly women, but people in general, just tend to not communicate sexually in those terms. And that's a shame. There was another point I was going to make. Oh, yeah. So many women will say things like, well, I didn't have an orgasm, but, I enjoyed being close to him. I enjoyed being intimate. And that's great. Like, you obviously should enjoy being close to your lover, enjoying spending that intimate time with them. But there is a point to having a sexual relationship with someone. It's because it feels good. It's supposed to feel good. And you are depriving yourself of that when you're not, having that as a standard for yourself. And on the flip side of this, how many men have you ever, heterosexual men, have you ever heard say, well, I didn't have an orgasm, but I really enjoyed just, like, being with her and being close to her. Like, that's much more rare. And so think about what that means in terms of, like, sexuality, this standardized sex, like the standard sex we have, or that we envision we're supposed to want or enjoy, doesn't even address the female sex organ. It doesn't address it at all. And what that means for sexual relationships in our culture, what that means for how men and women, but typically women, view themselves as sexual people, as what they deserve and what their standards should be in relationships. Like, this is obviously, like, a very complex topic, but I just want you to think about this. Like, yes, as a sexually reproducing species, it has to be penis and vagina, obviously, for reproductive purposes. But we all can agree that having sex, like you as a human adult, having sex with your lover, whether it's a male or female, is so much more than that. People have sex all the time not to reproduce. Like, we understand that we don't have to reproduce every time we have sex. That's not the point of it. There's so much more to it in terms of, like, who we are at a personal level, and a relationship level, culturally, socially. So while reproductively, biologically, evolutionarily, yes, that act in that sense makes sense, totally. But like I said, the complexity of it is so much more in terms of, like, who we are as people in our society, that we forget that. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is women females tend to be left out of that conversation or out of that experience. And I would say, I mean, this is one of the things I talked about before, I mentioned already. We can understand something evolutionarily, biologically, like that's exactly why that's happened. Makes total sense, absolutely. Now here is the problem now that we're seeing because of it, and this is one of those things. So just think about all these questions I've put on this PowerPoint about that. Okay, so let's see, what else do I have in here? I might just go through these quickly. This is already kind of a really long, I didn't mean for it to be this long, but hopefully you've stuck through it with me. Okay, so slide 43. So some more examples of sexual selection in humans. So here you can see another picture of a bar fight. You know, like I said before, we tend to think, oh, that's not the same. It is the same. It is not any different. Multiple examples of this. Voices. So, what was I going to say? I didn't even put any bullet points. I think there was something about, I think it was something like puberty and voices for males, how when they change, like this can be a sexually selective trait for females, unless like not a surprise to you guys, right? And then I have on slide 45, what about the cultural factors? I've already kind of included a lot of that discussion already. But this is what some of the people had pointed out in the discussion board about material possessions. Posing in pictures like for their dating profile with like, you know, a car or fancy clothing, and whether it's really yours or it's your car or not, or whether like how you can, you know, lie about that and hope that no one finds out, at least initially or ever, or is it the truth? And so, you know, that's interesting, but the information that you want to display is going to be really important. Like, what is the information? Like, if you're posing with a fancy car, what is all the background information you're trying to display with that? I have money, I have success, that makes me a quality person, male or female, you know, so. Jobs, okay, it's 46, so the job you have, 47, why is that not working? Okay, clothing. So this is obviously going to be different from culture to culture, like the type of clothing you might wear as a male or a female, in terms of like attracting a partner. It's going to be different. What does it mean? What clothing might you wear if you are trying to display that you might be sexually available or romantically available as a male or a female? Might be different than if you already are, let's say, in a long-term relationship or you're married. That might be different. The type of clothing you wear. 48, once again, material possessions, how you might display in some way your success. So we talked about this. Did we talk about, I keep saying that, but then I'm wondering, like, did I talk to you guys about this? About how, I'm almost positive we did. We talked about Dunbar's number and about how, like, evolutionarily we evolved in very small groups, you know, let's say 30 to 50. And because now our populations are so much larger, the way we, I think this was the cultural class, sorry guys. The way we, well, I'll just tell you now. So, evolutionarily, we evolved in very small groups, 30 to 50. You would know all the information about someone because you lived, like, you wouldn't need to, like, write it down. You'd remember it, like, that person's good at that person's bad at that, I like this person, I can trust this person, I can't trust that person. You would know all that information in your head. But there's a point when the population gets so big that you can't hold all that information in your head. There's no way that you would know every person in Vegas and whether you liked them, whether you didn't, whether you could trust them, whether they were dependable, whether they weren't. Like, you would not be able to hold all of that information in your head. So when we interact socially with people, you have to be able to display in some way vital information about yourself, whether it's just because of social or cultural reasons, whether it's for like mating reasons. It's multiple reasons why. But some of it might be like clothing you wear, a fancy watch or something. You might want to display your success or wealth in some way. Like so many examples of that. Slide 49, other behaviors. So this is just another point of thinking. I think I kind of touched on this a little bit on the discussion board. Like, what are some behaviors that you think people would use to indicate that they are a good potential mate? So that might be more like a long-term, like what behaviors, what might I do or display that might make it seem as if I'm going to be a good, like, long-term mate, or the second bullet point, or that I'm sexually available as a male or female. Those might be, different. Slide 50. Oh, this is interesting. So humans have a post-reproductive sex life. I'm just looking at the time, 40 minutes. Oh, goodness. I'm sorry. I hope some of you have stuck with me through this, because like I'm doing it, I'm recording it now. Hopefully this is much. I told you guys this one's long. Usually I spend at least 3 days in class. I thought I could do it in two kind of moderately not too long lectures, but this one's like super long. Sorry guys. Humans have a post-reproductive sexual life. So for female humans, we have menopause. But then that's like, you know, for the average woman, I feel like in America it's like 51 or something like that. But then females can live into 30, 40 years. This is very rare. So this is one of those instances where humans are unique in that. Like, we don't see that with other animals. It's very rare to see that, like in animals, and especially in other primates. Once a female can't reproduce anymore, she doesn't live very much longer after that. So like, this is really interesting for humans that we have this whole period for women, because for males it's basically they can pretty much reproduce for their whole lives for the most part. Females cannot. So this is interesting. And you know what, some of the stuff at the end, I think I've already kind of touched on this in general throughout, so I'm not going to go through these. Okay, so that's going to be the end of it. Okay, so sorry this was a bit longer, but hopefully it was worth it to you. Hopefully you got some you know, started thinking about a lot of this, and hopefully this helps with some of the discussions for this one and the future ones, and hopefully this just, you know, made you think about a little bit of this. I know I brought in a lot of the cultural stuff in this lecture, and you know, hopefully you understood why, and I'll see you guys on the next one.